She built an empire from the ruins of a broken bond, and the man who threw her away never saw it coming. Lena Vale gave 5 years of her life to a king who mistook her loyalty for weakness. 5 years of standing beside the throne, bleeding quietly so the kingdom never had to. And on the night Darius Thorne walked through the palace gates with another woman carrying his child, Lena didn't scream. She didn't beg. She stood straight, absorbed every blow of that public humiliation in front of the entire pack, and made a decision that would shake every kingdom from the northern frost to the southern plains. This is the story of what happens when the woman a king underestimated decides she's done being underestimated. Stay until the end, hit that like button, and drop your city in the comments. I want to know where my pack is watching from tonight. The night it ended didn't announce itself. There was no storm rolling in from the northern range. No crack of thunder splitting the sky above Thornhold Palace the way the old stories always promised when something irreversible was about to happen. The evening came in quiet and copper-colored, the kind of late autumn dusk that smelled like wood smoke and cold earth, and Lena Vale stood at the tall window of the eastern corridor, watching the last of it fade because she had learned long ago that beautiful things didn't stay. She heard the gates before she saw anything, the heavy iron groan of them swinging wide, the sudden shout of the perimeter guards. Not alarm, something worse. Celebration. The kind of noise men made when they were trying too hard to seem pleased about something that hadn't been their choice. Lena set down the report she'd been reading. Pack census numbers from the outer settlements, 14 pages of grain tallies, and winter preparation logs that she had been working through since mid-morning because someone in this palace actually had to. She smoothed the page flat with her palm, a habit, a small mechanical thing she did when her chest started doing things she didn't want it to do. She walked to the window. Below, in the wide cobblestone courtyard that Darius had rebuilt 3 years ago out of imported black stone, a display of wealth she had quietly argued against because the northern road still needed repair, the main procession was coming through. Torches lit, horses champing, and Darius at the front of it, sitting tall in the saddle the way he always did when he wanted every eye on him, chin lifted, jaw set, with that particular angle she had memorized in the early years when she still believed that jaw meant strength rather than performance. Beside him, riding a pale gray mare that somebody had clearly saddled in a hurry, was a woman Lena had never seen. Young, dark-haired, wrapped in a traveling cloak that had been expensive once but was road-worn at the hem, the kind of thing a woman packed when she left somewhere fast. One hand on the reins, the other resting low against her abdomen in a gesture so automatic, so unconscious, that Lena understood everything before a single word was spoken. She stood at the window for a long moment. Her reflection looked back at her from the dark glass. Brown hair pulled back, the small scar along her jaw from the border skirmish 4 years ago, when she had ridden out with the patrol because the eastern flank was short 3 scouts, and she refused to send men into terrain she hadn't walked herself. She looked at her own face and thought, with a strange flat clarity, that she did not look like a woman whose world was ending. She looked like a woman doing inventory. Maybe that was the same thing. She turned from the window and walked back to her desk and picked up the census report. She read the next 3 pages straight through. She could hear the commotion below building, voices multiplying in the courtyard, the particular pitch of noise that meant the senior pack members were gathering, that the arrival was being made into something official and witnessed. When she heard the doors to the great hall bang open 2 floors down, she folded the report, set it in the correspondence tray, and walked out. The great hall of Thornhold Palace held 300 standing easy. That night it held closer to 400. The senior wolves pressed shoulder to shoulder along the gallery rails. The lower-ranking pack members crowded at the back near the service doors. Every face tipped toward the dais where Darius stood, with the woman from the courtyard positioned 2 steps to his right. Lena came in through the side corridor. She had not been summoned. That fact registered somewhere in the back of her mind, and she filed it away without reacting to it because she was very good at that, at filing things. She took her place at the front of the room, a path cleared for her without anyone needing to be asked. 5 years as Luna had built that much. And she walked it straight, chin level, hands loose at her sides. She could feel the quality of the room's silence shifting as people registered her presence. The sudden held breath quality of 400 wolves who all knew something was about to happen, and none of them wanted to be the one caught looking too hard. Darius saw her immediately. He had always had good eyes. That was one of the first things she'd noticed about him. Pale gray, the color of river ice, sharp enough to pick out detail at distances most wolves couldn't manage. They found her across the crowded room, and for just a fraction of a second, something moved in them. Not guilt. She had learned not to mistake reflex for guilt. And then the public face came back down over it like a curtain. Lena. His voice carried the room easily. It always had. Good. You're here. She said nothing. She was waiting. He put one hand on the small of the woman's back. The room felt that. A visible ripple moving through the crowd, people recalibrating, adjusting their expressions. This is Celine Cross, Darius said. She'll be taking up residence in the palace. Permanent quarters. East Wing. He said it the way he announced military appointments, flat and already decided, the tone that left no conversational space for anything that wasn't acknowledgement. She carries my air. The hall went so quiet Lena could hear someone's boot shift on the stone floor 12 feet away. She stood completely still. There is a specific kind of pain that doesn't hit immediately. It waits. It sits in the gap between hearing words and understanding them, in that small delay while the brain insists on running them through one more time to be certain. Lena's mind ran it through. Permanent quarters. East Wing. My air. She stood in the gap and breathed through it and kept her face exactly the way it was, which was nothing, which was the expression she had perfected over 5 years of standing beside a man who made decisions and expected a queen to absorb them. Celine Cross looked at her with the careful neutrality of a woman who had prepared for this meeting and was working hard to look like she hadn't. Lena looked back. Congratulations, Lena said. The word came out clean. She aimed it at neither of them specifically, let it land somewhere in the general air of the dais, and then she turned and walked back the way she had come. She heard the noise start behind her before she reached the corridor. The 400 voices finding their release, the rush of talk, the kind of sound a crowd made when something they'd been tensed for finally broke. She didn't look back. She walked the side corridor, took the servants' stairs at the end of it because they were faster than the main staircase and she needed fast right now. She needed walls around her and a door between herself and everything that room contained. She made it to the 3rd floor before her legs started shaking. It was just her legs. The rest of her held. She stopped at the window seat at the top of the stairs and sat down on the cold stone of it and pressed both hands flat against her thighs and breathed, slow and deliberate, 4 counts in, hold, 6 counts out. The same thing she had taught the younger pack members to do when they came back from difficult patrols with their hands still unsteady. The irony was not lost on her. She breathed through it and waited for her legs to stop. Her chambers were at the end of the hall. She walked into them and closed the door and stood in the middle of the room in the dark for a while. The East Wing. He had given Celine the East Wing. The East Wing housed the secondary royal quarters, the rooms traditionally used by a king's family, by heirs and their households. The rooms that stood between Lena's chambers and the outer gallery, so that every morning when Lena walked the corridor, she would pass the door of the woman carrying her husband's child. She didn't know if Darius had thought that through, or if he simply hadn't bothered to think it through at all, and she found that she couldn't determine which possibility was worse. She lit one lamp. Just one. She sat on the edge of the bed, the wide, cold bed that Darius had not slept in with any regularity in 8 months, a fact she had told herself was about the pressures of kingdom leadership and the stress of the border disputes and a dozen other things that were probably true in addition to being convenient. And she looked at the room, 5 years of her life in this room. The tapestry on the eastern wall she had commissioned from the weavers in the Highland settlements, 3 months to complete, depicting the original founding families of the Pack territory because she had believed it mattered for the people who came to these halls to see their history reflected back at them. The small writing desk under the window where she had worked most mornings since the first year because Darius preferred the study and she preferred light. The wardrobe that held 12 ceremonial gowns and 8 working garments, and the old leather riding jacket she'd worn the day she left her own father's territory to come here, and which she had never been able to make herself give away. She put her face in her hands, not to cry. She was aware that she wasn't crying, that the thing happening in her chest was something else, something with more weight than tears, the kind of grief that didn't have a release valve. She put her face in her hands and sat with it in the 1 lamp's worth of light and let herself understand it fully, because she had always believed it was more dangerous not to understand a thing than to look at it directly. She had spent 5 years being indispensable. Not beloved, indispensable. There was a difference, and she had known the difference for at least 2 of those 5 years, but she had stayed because she loved him, because she had believed that love and utility were building towards something, that the kingdom they were holding together was the foundation of something worth the cost of it. She had ridden border patrols and mediated pack disputes, and sat through 14-hour council sessions, and read grain census reports, and held the eastern settlements together through 2 bad harvests with nothing but her own credibility and her refusal to let the southern suppliers see weakness. And he had come home with a pregnant woman and given her the East Wing and announced it to 400 people without a word of warning and expected Lena to stand there and absorb it. She lifted her face from her hands. She was done absorbing. The knock on her door came 2 hours later. She had spent those 2 hours doing something purposeful, which was better than the alternative. She had pulled 3 trunks from the wardrobe room and set them open on the floor, and she was working through her belongings with the same methodical focus she brought to census reports. The things that were hers, the writing jacket, the correspondence files, the small locked box that held the personal letters from the settlement leaders she had built relationships with over 5 years, went into the trunks. The things that belonged to the palace stayed where they were. The ceremonial gowns stayed. The tapestry stayed. She was not taking what wasn't hers. She opened the door. Marin, her personal attendant, stood in the corridor. 22 years old, the daughter of a Gamma family from the western edge of the territory, who had come to the palace at 17 and attached herself to Lena with a loyalty that had never wavered, and that Lena had tried not to lean on too hard because she knew what it cost a young woman to give that kind of loyalty to a person who might one day be in no position to protect her. Marin looked at the open trunks. Her face did something complicated. Then she straightened and said, "What do you need?" "Nothing," Lena said. "Go to bed." "Luna, don't." The word came out harder than she intended. She softened it. "Please, tonight I need you to go to your room and be somewhere I don't have to worry about you." Marin's jaw set. "I heard what he said in the hall." The whole pack heard what he said in the hall. That was the point. It was wrong. The girl's voice cracked on the last word, just slightly, then steadied. What he did was wrong, and everyone knows it, and no one said anything, and I don't know how you're just standing there packing like... Marin. Lena waited until the girl looked at her. "I'm standing here packing because packing is something I can do. Right now it is the one thing I can do that isn't falling apart in a corridor, so I'm doing it." She looked at the girl steadily. "You understand that?" A long pause. Marin understood it. She had seen enough of Lena's particular brand of surviving to understand the mechanics of it. "Let me help," Marin said quietly. Lena looked at her for a moment. Then she stepped back from the door and let her in. They worked in silence mostly. Marin knew which things were Lena's and which belonged to the palace, had been in this room enough years to know the difference without asking, and she packed with a quiet efficiency that made the work go faster. Somewhere below them, the palace was still loud with the aftermath of the evening's announcement. Voices carrying up through the stones, the sound of celebration beginning in the lower halls where the pack members were drinking to the unborn heir and the king's virility and all the other things men drank to when a powerful man got what he wanted at someone else's expense. "Where will you go?" Marin asked. "North." Marin's hand stilled on the clasp of the second trunk. "Black Hollow?" "Yes." "Luna." Marin's voice was careful now, the tone of someone choosing words. "That's Viol territory. Aldrich Vale hasn't answered a royal summons in 3 years. His pack runs hard. They don't... I know what they are." Lena closed the lid of the first trunk. "I also know they have no reason to love Darius Thorne, and right now, that makes them the only people I can trust to not hand me back." Silence. Then Marin said, "I want to come with you." "No." "Lena, no?" Lena turned to face her fully. "What happens after I leave is going to get complicated. Darius is going to be angry. He is going to be angry in the specific way powerful men get angry when something doesn't go the way they'd planned, which means he will look for someone to be angry at. I need you to still be here. I need someone still here who knows the truth of things." She paused. "Can you do that for me?" The girl's eyes were bright. She held them steady with what was clearly an enormous effort of will, the kind of discipline that Lena recognized because she had spent 5 years teaching it to herself. and after a long moment, she nodded. They finished the packing just before the second hour of morning. Lena stood in the middle of the room that had been hers for 5 years and looked at it one final time. One lamp lit. 3 trunks by the door. The tapestry on the wall with the founding families woven into it, and no one left who remembered why it mattered. She picked up the old leather riding jacket from the top of the nearest trunk and pulled it on, and the weight of it across her shoulders was the closest thing she had felt to comfort in hours. She was at the door when Marin caught her hand. The girl didn't say anything. She held Lena's hand for 3 seconds and then let go, and Lena walked out. She took the back stairs to the stable yard. The night was sharp with frost, the kind of cold that got into the lungs on the first breath, and reminded you that winter in the Northern Territories was not a season you survived by being soft. 2 of the stable hands were asleep in the tack room. She saddled her own horse, a black mare named Sable, who had been with her 4 years and who nickered once at her approach, and then stood perfectly still while she worked, as if the horse understood the particular quality of the silence Lena was moving through. She loaded the trunks herself into the pack saddle on the secondary horse she took from the guest string. She rode out through the back gate. No one stopped her. The gate guard was a young man named Pell, who had been on the Eastern Patrol she'd ridden out with 2 winters ago, who had been sick with a cold that trip, and who she had made sure was rotated to lighter duty for the week after they returned so he could recover without losing face in front of the senior wolves. He looked at her in the dark with the trunks loaded and the riding jacket and everything else about the picture she made, and he opened the gate without a word, and when she rode through, he touched 2 fingers to his jaw in the old pack gesture, the one that meant something like, "I see you," something like "I won't forget." She didn't look back at the palace. She had made her peace with looking at things directly, and she knew that if she looked back, she would see the lit windows and the dark towers and 5 years of her life standing there, and she would either turn around or she would break, and she could not afford either. She rode north. The road out of Thornhold widened at the first mile marker and then narrowed again as it climbed toward the Highland Pass, the trees thickening on either side, the night deepening to the kind of black that had nothing to do with light sources and everything to do with wilderness. Sable moved steady beneath her. The cold pressed in from all directions. Lena was 4 miles from the palace when she heard the hoofbeats. Single horse. Fast. Coming from behind her, gaining, not trying to be quiet about it. She didn't stop. She kept her pace and put one hand on the short blade at her hip and waited, because she had learned that waiting with a hand on something solid was better than running, that running told people things about you that you couldn't always afford to have them know. The rider pulled up alongside her. Marin. Wrapped in a traveling cloak, a pack strapped to her saddle, her face set with an expression that Lena recognized as the specific stubbornness that meant the conversation was already over. "I told you no," Lena said. "You did," Marin agreed. "I decided I didn't care." Lena looked at her for a long moment in the dark. The girl looked back. "If you come with me," Lena said carefully, "there is no coming back to this pack easily. Not if Darius decides to make an example. You understand what you're giving up." "I understand exactly what I'm giving up," Marin said. "The question is whether you're going to waste time arguing about it, or whether we're going to ride." The trees moved around them. The cold pressed down. Somewhere far behind them, the lit windows of Thornhold Palace were invisible now, swallowed by distance and dark. Lena looked at the road north. "Keep up," she said, and rode. They made the Highland Pass by dawn and started the descent into the open rangeland beyond it, as the sky went gray and then pale gold, the frost burning off the grass in slow drifts of mist. Lena rode hard. She had 4 days of hard travel to the Black Hollow border, and she intended to use all of them. It was on the second day when they stopped to water the horses at a creek crossing midway through the rangeland that they found the riders waiting, 6 of them. On the far bank, sitting still on horses the color of smoke and iron, wearing the black-edged riding leathers of a pack that did not fly any royal banner and did not apologize for it. One of them was out front, sitting a little apart from the rest, and even at 40 yards, Lena could see the quality of his stillness, the kind that didn't come from patience but from confidence, from a man who had never been in a situation he couldn't handle, and who therefore saw no reason to shift in his saddle while he waited. Aldrich Vale. She had never met him. She had read the intelligence reports on him, every report for 3 years, because understanding the Northern Territories had been her job. She knew he was 34. She knew he had held Black Hollow against 2 royal enforcement actions in the last decade. She knew that 3 alpha challenges had been brought against him, and that all 3 challengers had eventually withdrawn, which was more telling than 3 victories would have been, because it meant the challengers had looked at what they were dealing with and decided it wasn't worth the cost. She knew he was not supposed to know she was coming. She crossed the creek. Sable's hooves scattered silver against the current, and she rode up the far bank and stopped 10 feet from him and looked at him directly, the way she had learned to look at things, and he looked back at her with eyes that were dark and assessing and gave nothing away. "Luna Vale," he said. His voice was lower than she'd expected, rougher. "Not Luna anything anymore," she said. Something shifted in his face. Not sympathy. She didn't think he had a great deal of that in him. Something more useful. Recognition, maybe? The kind one person feels for another who has walked a particular road. "I know," he said. "That's why I'm here." Lena felt the hairs rise on the back of her neck. "Who told you?" she asked. Aldrich Vale looked at her for a long moment, and then he said the name. And it was a name that changed everything. A name that meant what had happened at Thornhold Palace 3 nights ago had not been a man's betrayal, but something far older and far more deliberate, a trap years in the making, and the woman who had supposedly stolen her husband was not a rival, but a weapon. And someone had aimed that weapon directly at Lena. The name Aldrich Vale spoke on that frost-cut riverbank was Counselor Heron Voss. Lena knew that name. She had worked beside that name for 4 years, sat across from it in budget sessions, traded correspondence with it about grain allocation and border enforcement, read its careful handwriting on 100 official documents, and believed, the way you believe in the structural integrity of a floor until it gives way beneath you, that it was on the side of the kingdom she had been holding together. She said nothing for 3 seconds. Aldrich watched her absorb it. He didn't rush her. That was the first thing she noted about him. Not the size of him, or the controlled stillness, or the quality of his riders at his back, but the fact that he gave her the 3 seconds without trying to fill them. Most powerful men she had known could not tolerate silence in another person. It made them anxious. They talked into it. Aldrich Vale waited. "How do you know Voss?" she asked. "He made contact with my Eastern scouts 8 months ago," Aldrich said. "Wanted to discuss trade arrangements. What he actually wanted was to take the measure of how hard I'd push back if Thornhold decided to move on the northern territories formally." He shifted his weight slightly in the saddle. He wasn't subtle about it. Men like Voss never are when they think they're talking to someone they can use. "And you told him what?" "I told him Black Hollow doesn't negotiate under implicit threat." His jaw moved. "Then I had him followed back to Thornhold. Turns out he had 3 other meetings on that same trip. 2 with pack lords who've been quiet for years. 1 with a woman traveling under a merchant's name from the southern coast." Lena's hands were still on Sable's reins. She made herself keep them still. "Celine Cross," she said. "Celine Cross," he confirmed. Behind her, she could hear Marin's horse shifting on the wet bank. The creek ran cold and fast between the stones. Somewhere up in the tree line, a bird called once and went quiet. "That's not proof of anything," Lena said. "Voss travels. Meetings happen." "I know." Aldrich looked at her evenly. "I'm not handing you a court case. I'm handing you what I know because you rode out of Thornhold 2 nights ago with 3 trunks and a girl, and you're headed into my territory. And I'd rather you know what you're walking into than find out the wrong way later." She studied his face. The intelligence reports had described him as calculating and territorial, neither of which was wrong, but they had not described this. The directness of him. The way he spoke like a man who had decided years ago that honesty was simply the most efficient tool and had never seen reason to change that assessment. "Why help me at all?" she asked. Something in his expression shifted just slightly. Not softness. More like acknowledgement. "Because Darius Thorne has been pushing north for 3 years, and the only reason he hasn't pushed harder is that the council kept arguing against the resource cost. Voss was the loudest voice for restraint in those sessions." He paused. "Which means whoever Voss is really working for doesn't want Darius moving north yet. They want him consolidating power at home first, eliminating variables." "I'm a variable," Lena said flatly. "You were the variable," Aldrich said. "The one person in that palace with enough actual authority and actual competence to see what was being built and potentially stop it. So yes, Getting you out of Thornhold was part of it. The morning light was flat and white off the frost-burned grass. Lena looked at the range land stretching north and then back at the man in front of her, the 6 riders at his back who had not moved, had not shifted or muttered or done any of the things a group of men usually did when they were waiting, disciplined, patient, a reflection of their leader. She had ridden out of Thornhold with nothing. No title, no pack authority, no official standing of any kind. She had 3 trunks and a girl who had followed her against direct instruction and a riding jacket that was 4 years old. And a name. "Take me to Black Hollow," she said. Aldrich held her gaze for one more beat. Then he turned his horse north without ceremony, and his riders parted to let her through. They rode hard for the rest of the day. Black Hollow came into view in the late afternoon as the sun dropped behind the ridgeline, and the shadow of the highland pine forest fell long and cold across the valley. Lena had read descriptions of it in the intelligence files. The reports had called it a fortified settlement, which was technically accurate the way calling a battle-hardened wolf a large dog was technically accurate. What it was a working territory built by people who had chosen difficulty over submission for long enough that the difficulty had become the point. The buildings were stone and heavy timber, low-roofed against the northern wind, with the particular weathered look of structures that had been repaired many times and never once prettified. The wall around the main compound was not decorative. The watch posts at the corners were manned by people who tracked Lena and her horse and Marin and the pack animals all the way through the outer gate with eyes that evaluated rather than welcomed. And Lena noted that and noted also that no one moved to block them because Aldrich was at the front. She noted everything. It was the only advantage she currently had, the ability to look at a situation and read it accurately. And she was not wasting it. They dismounted in the inner yard. A young man took Sable's reins and Lena let him, watched the way he handled the mare, competent, no wasted motion. The horse relaxed under his hands, and adjusted her read of the territory's general quality upward slightly. "You'll have your own quarters," Aldrich said, coming to stand beside her while a second man dealt with the pack animals. "Not guest quarters. Working space, if you want it. My council meets tomorrow morning. You're welcome to attend as an observer." "Observer," she said. "For now." He looked at her sideways. "You want something other than observer? You earn it. That's how it works here." She could have pushed back on that. She had been Luna of Thornhold for 5 years, and she was not accustomed to starting at the bottom of anything. She felt the reflex, the straightening of her spine, the instinct to establish standing immediately, to make clear that she was not a supplicant. She let it go. "Observer is fine," she said. He nodded once. He almost looked like he had expected her to argue. The quarters were on the second floor of the main building, 3 connected rooms that smelled like pine resin and cold stone, and the faint metal tang of the smithy somewhere below. Functional, clean, a hearth that drew well, a writing table under the window, a bed frame built for someone who took sleeping seriously. Lena stood in the middle of it after Aldrich left and breathed. Marin came in behind her and set their packs down and looked at the room with the expression of someone working very hard to find something positive to say. "It's warm," Marin offered. "Go sleep," Lena told her. "Actual sleep, not watching the door." "I don't watch the—" "Marin, I know you watch the door. Go sleep." "No, you." The girl went. Lena sat at the writing table and stared at the frost on the window glass until the fire had burned down to coals and the room had gone dark and quiet around her, and then she let herself, for the first time since the courtyard, and the pale gray mare, and the hand on the abdomen, think it through from the beginning. Heron Voss, Celine Cross, 8 months of groundwork, 3 other meetings on the same trip, pack lords who had been quiet. Someone had wanted her out of Thornhold. Not just Darius inconveniently distracted, not just a man making a selfish choice. Someone had engineered the conditions of her removal, had found a woman willing to play the part, had cultivated the council member best positioned to manage the aftermath, had timed it for the autumn when pack politics traditionally consolidated around the winter council sessions, when a leadership disruption would cause maximum downstream damage. That level of planning meant resources. It meant patience. It meant someone who understood Thornhold's internal architecture well enough to know exactly which piece to remove. She thought about what was left when you took her out of that palace. Darius, who was formidable in open confrontation and nearly useless at the kind of sustained administrative attention that kept a kingdom functional. A council that had just lost its most credible internal check. An heir on the way, which meant succession questions, which meant the kind of political maneuvering that started quiet and ended bloody. Someone had handed Darius a throne he was about to find he couldn't hold, and she was here. She went to the council meeting in the morning. It was 8 people around a table that had clearly been bought for a smaller room. Everyone was pressed in close, elbows near enough to touch, and nobody seemed to mind. Aldrich sat at the head with his arms crossed and a cup of something dark and hot that he did not offer to share, which she suspected was deliberate. Not rudeness, but a small provocation. A see how she reads it. She sat in the observer's chair against the wall and read it as a man establishing the terms of engagement in his own space, which was reasonable, and did not react. The meeting was about the Southern water rights dispute. 3 of the smaller packs that bordered Black Hollow territory had been diverting creek flow for late-season irrigation, and the downstream effects were hitting Black Hollow's winter stock pools. The council members argued about it with the particular controlled intensity of people who had been arguing about the same problem for months, and had stopped being polite about it. Lena listened for 40 minutes. Then the oldest council member, a woman named Kala with gray-streaked hair and the deliberate movements of someone managing a bad knee, said, "We send another letter. Make the demand formal." "We've sent 3 formal letters," said the man across from her, who had the build of a fighter and the hands of someone who worked them regularly. "Formal letters aren't moving anything." "Then we take the eastern pool back by force," said a third. "That starts a conflict we don't need heading into winter," Aldrich said, flat. The table went quiet with the particular quality of people who knew their leader was right but didn't have a better option. Lena said, "The Harwick pack is the primary diverter. The other 2 are following Harwick's lead because they think Harwick has the weight to back the play. Remove Harwick's confidence in that assumption, and the others realign without a confrontation." The room looked at her. Aldrich looked at her last, and the look lasted longer. "And how," Kala said carefully, "do we remove that confidence? Harwick's pack lord has a debt call coming due from Thornhold in the spring, royal levy on 2 seasons of delayed border tax." Lena kept her voice even. "That levy is currently sitting in the administrative queue because I was the one managing the collection schedule, and I am no longer there to manage it, which means whoever picks it up at Thornhold, assuming anyone does, will have leverage over Harwick that Harwick is currently hoping nobody remembers." She paused. "Let him know that someone remembers. You don't need to threaten anything. You just need to make clear that the information exists and that Black Hollow is aware of it." Silence. "You have that documentation?" Aldrich asked. "In my head," she said. "I can write it out in sufficient detail to be useful." Another silence. The fighter with the calloused hands was looking at her with an expression that was not friendly, but was the specific kind of interested that meant he was recalibrating. Aldrich said, "After the meeting." She stayed after the meeting. They worked at the long table for 2 hours, Lena dictating from memory, a young council aide writing it out in the shorthand Black Hollow, apparently used for sensitive documents. The aide was fast and accurate and asked good clarifying questions, and when they were done, Aldrich read through the 3 pages without comment for a long time. "This is solid," he said. "I know it is." He looked up from the pages. "How much more of this do you have?" 5 years of administrative records," she said. "Every levy, every border agreement, every debt call and deferred payment and quiet arrangement that Thornhold made in the last decade. I didn't carry documents out with me. I didn't need to." She tapped her temple once, a small gesture. "It's here." Aldrich set the pages down. "That makes you valuable," he said. It didn't come out as a compliment exactly, more like an assessment, a man adjusting the weight he was placing on a particular asset. "I know that too," she said. He was quiet for a moment. The fire in the council room had burned down since the morning session, and the room had gone cooler, the light shifting to the flat gray of midday cloud cover. He looked at her the way she was finding he looked at most things, with the complete attention of a man who did not half see anything. "Why did you really come north?" he said. Not a question, more like an invitation to say the true version out loud. She thought about giving him the practical answer, the one about needing territory outside Darius's reach, about having no allies left in the south, about the cold logic of running toward the least hostile option. All of it was true. "Because I spent 5 years making a kingdom function," she said, "and the man I made it function for didn't notice and didn't care and was never going to, and I am not—" She stopped, pressed the sentence flat, started again. I am not going to spend what comes next being something a man owns and undervalues. I'd rather build something of my own from nothing. Aldrich looked at her for a long time. Building from nothing is harder than it sounds, he said. I know what hard looks like, she said. I'm not afraid of it. He nodded slowly. Something in his face had shifted, barely perceptible, the smallest recalibration. Then he stood and picked up the 3 pages and said, I'll send a writer to Harwick tomorrow. You'll want to be there when the response comes back. She stood also. Observer? The corner of his mouth moved. It wasn't quite a smile. Advisor, he said. Conditional. She walked back to her quarters through the cold yard in the frost-bright afternoon, and for the first time in 4 days, the shaking in her chest had gone quiet, replaced by something steadier and more dangerous. Not hope exactly. The thing that lived underneath hope, in the part of a person that hadn't been burned off yet. She had been in Black Hollow for 18 hours. She was already 2 moves into a game that Darius didn't know had started. The rider from Thornhold arrived on the 4th day. She was in the yard working the horses. Sable needed moving and working. The horses was the kind of physical task that cleared her head, that turned the grinding rotation of calculation into something she could put down for an hour. When the outer gate opened and one of Aldrich's bordermen came through with a Thornhold royal messenger in tow. Royal colors. The dark green and silver of Thornhold's formal communication corps, which meant this was official, which meant Darius. She stopped moving. Sable stamped once beside her. Aldrich came out of the main building. He had clearly been told the rider was coming before the gate opened. The man had an information network that worked faster than anything she had seen outside of a standing army. He crossed the yard with the unhurried pace of someone who had decided before the conversation started that he would not be rushing anything on anyone else's timeline. The messenger dismounted. Young, travel-worn, his green livery dusty from the road. He looked at Lena standing in the yard with a horse and a lead line and the leather jacket, and then looked away from her with the specific deliberateness of a man who had been told something about what he might find here and was working to pretend he hadn't been told. He held out the sealed document to Aldrich. Aldrich took it, broke the seal, read it. His face gave nothing away. He handed it to Lena. She read it standing in the yard with Sable warm against her shoulder. The letter was in Darius's handwriting, the big assured strokes of a man who had been told his penmanship was impressive often enough to believe it. The language was formal, but the subtext was not. It called her return to Thornhold a matter of kingdom stability. It mentioned twice the importance of the Luna's role in times of succession. It did not apologize. It did not explain. It told her to come home. It told her. She read it twice. Then she folded it along its original crease lines and held it in one hand. He expects an answer, the messenger said carefully. He'll get one, Lena said. She walked to the fire pit at the center of the yard where the morning burn barrel was still warm from the day's trash clearing. She dropped the letter into it, watched the green and silver seal catch and blacken and curl. The messenger made a small sound, not quite a protest, the sound of a man recalculating what he was going to report. Tell the Alpha King, Lena said, still watching the fire, that the Luna position is vacant and that I suggest he get used to that. She turned back to the horse. Behind her, the messenger stood in the yard for several seconds. Then she heard his boots on the cobblestone, the creak of saddle leather, the retreat of hooves toward the gate. Aldrich said nothing. She could feel him standing 10 feet away, watching, but he said nothing, and she appreciated that more than she had expected to. She ran a hand down Sable's neck. The mare turned her head and blew a warm breath against Lena's jaw. It was the right call. She knew it was the right call. She had burned the bridge deliberately with open eyes, because the bridge led back to a place that would have consumed whatever was left of her, and she could not afford to leave herself a way back. The calculation was clean. What she hadn't prepared for was the weight of it, the specific gravity of a door closing permanently, the way the body registered finality even when the mind had already accepted it, a hollow drop somewhere below the sternum, a breath that didn't come back quite right. She breathed through it, gave herself 30 seconds, which was the amount of time she had decided was fair. Then she led Sable back to the stable and went inside to plan her next move. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, standing in that yard with the ash of Darius's letter still rising on the cold air, was that a second rider had left Thornhold the same morning. Not a royal messenger, not in official colors. This one traveled unmarked, took the lesser roads, changed horses twice. And it was not carrying a message to her. It was carrying instructions about her. The second rider reached Black Hollow on the 7th day, not through the front gate. Through the eastern drainage culvert that ran beneath the outer wall, which meant someone had told him it existed, which meant someone inside Black Hollow had talked. Aldrich's border watch found him before he made it 20 yards past the wall, pinned him against the storage building with 3 blades at angles that did not allow for comfortable breathing, and brought him to the main hall stripped of his weapons and his unmarked riding leathers and his carefully constructed story about being a lost trader from the southern range. Lena was at the writing table in her quarters when Calla knocked. "Aldrich wants you downstairs," Calla said. Her voice had the flat quality of someone delivering information they didn't fully understand yet. Now, the man was sitting in the center of the main hall on a chair that had been pulled away from any wall, any table, anything he could use as a reference point or brace himself against. That kind of deliberate spatial isolation, Lena had seen it used in interrogations. It worked on a specific psychological principle. A person without walls at their back spends cognitive energy compensating for the exposure, which left less cognitive energy for lying. He was maybe 30, brown hair, travel-worn face, the careful blankness of a man who had been trained to hold an expression under pressure. 2 of Aldrich's fighters stood behind him, 2 more at the door. Aldrich himself stood across the room with his arms at his sides, and the quality of stillness she had come to recognize as his version of controlled anger. Not heat, but the complete absence of any wasted motion, a compression. He looked at her when she came in. "Tell her what you told me," he said to the man in the chair. The man looked at Lena. Something moved in his face. Recalculation, the kind that happened when a situation turned out to contain something you hadn't been briefed on. "I don't know who she is," the man said. "That's a lie," Aldrich said, without inflection. A pause. The fire in the main hearth cracked. Outside, the wind had come up against the building, the particular low moan of northern gusts finding the gaps in heavy timber. "I was sent to observe," the man said finally. "Confirm her location. Report back." "To whom?" Lena said. He looked at her again. The recalculation again, slower this time. The look of a man deciding how much the information he was sitting on was worth in the current market. "Voss," he said. The name landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Lena watched the ripple of it move through Aldrich's fighters, the small adjustments, the tightening. She had known it was Voss. Aldrich had told her it was Voss. She had spent 6 days working with the confirmed knowledge that Herren Voss was operating against her. But knowing a thing intellectually and hearing it spoken aloud in a cold hall by a man who had crawled through a drainage culvert to spy on her, those were different experiences. Her body registered the difference, a tightening across the back of her shoulders, a shift in her breathing that she controlled before it became visible. "What were your instructions if you confirmed my location?" she said. The man said nothing. "He's already told us the relevant part," Aldrich said. "I want the rest." Aldrich looked at her, then he looked at the man. "Answer her." Another pause. Longer. The man was doing math. "What does it cost me to say this versus what happens if I don't?" "Confirmation of location triggers the next stage," he said. "I don't know what the next stage is. That's the truth. I'm a courier and a scout. They don't tell couriers and scouts the full plan." "But there is a full plan," Lena said. "There's always a full plan with Voss," the man said, and there was something in his voice that wasn't quite contempt and wasn't quite fear. The tone of a man who had been close enough to Herren Voss to understand the scale of what he operated, and had spent time trying not to think about it too directly. Aldrich sent her a look across the room. She read it clearly. "This is as far as he goes tonight." She nodded once and walked back out. She did not sleep. She sat at the writing table and thought about stages. What came after confirmation of location? Voss had moved her out of Thornhold. That was stage 1. Stage 2 had presumably been counting on her isolation, her loss of standing, the expectation that a woman stripped of title and pack would spend her energy on survival rather than opposition. She had disrupted that by arriving somewhere useful, by proving valuable quickly, by beginning to build before anyone had anticipated she would build, which meant stage 2 was adjusting. She thought about what Voss actually wanted. Not Darius removed. If anything, he needed Darius on the throne, needed the appearance of legitimate royal authority while the real power redistributed beneath it. What he wanted was control of the administrative apparatus of the kingdom, the budget, the border agreements, the debt calls, the trade arrangements, all the invisible machinery that most people never saw and that she had spent 5 years managing. Without her at Thornhold, that machinery was running unattended, and now someone knew exactly where she was. She wrote for 3 hours. Everything she could reconstruct about Voss's network, the names from council sessions, the financial arrangements she had noticed and filed away, the 2 occasions she had caught discrepancies in the border tax records and had raised them and been told they were clerical errors. She wrote it all out in the Black Hollow shorthand she had learned from the aide in 4 days, because she learned things fast when the alternative was vulnerability. She was halfway through the 4th page when she heard it. A sound from below. Not the natural nighttime sounds of the building settling, not the watch rotation she had already memorized by rhythm. A human sound. Hurried steps on the back stairs. The ones that connected the storage level to the sleeping quarters. Steps with the particular cadence of someone trying to move fast while trying not to be heard. She set down the pen. She was at the door before the knock came. Marin stood in the corridor. Her face was wrong. "What?" Lena said. "There's someone you need to talk to." Marin's voice was stripped of everything except the fact. "She came to my window. She's been waiting outside the wall for 2 hours. She said she couldn't come through the gate." Lena looked at her. "She said to tell you her name," Marin said. "She said you'd come if you knew." The name Marin said was one Lena had not heard in 6 years. Petra Fenn, who had been her closest friend in the years before Thornhold, who had left the territory they'd both grown up in to join a coastal pack, and who Lena had exchanged letters with for the first 2 years, and then lost contact with in the way that happened when a person's life became too consuming for anything outside it. Petra Fenn, who had no reason to be at the northern edge of the known territories in the middle of the night. She pulled on the riding jacket and followed Marin down. The woman waiting in the shadows against the outer wall's eastern face was Petra, but a version of Petra that 5 years had changed considerably. Thinner, harder around the eyes, the kind of compressed quality a person developed when they had spent a long time in circumstances that did not permit ease. She grabbed Lena's arm when she got close enough and Lena let her, because the grip was desperate, and Petra had never been a desperate person. "How bad is it?" Lena said quietly. "Bad enough that I rode 6 days straight to get here." Petra's voice was rough with exhaustion and something deeper. "Bad enough that I couldn't put it in a letter." Lena looked at her face. "Tell me." "Voss isn't just working against you," Petra said. "He's been working against Thornhold for 2 years. The whole structure of it. The succession question, Selene Cross, getting you out. It's all been building toward the Grand Moon Summit. The Grand Moon Summit. 3 months away. The gathering held every 5 years where all the major pack lords and their councils convened to renegotiate territorial agreements, trade rights, border law. The one event that required every significant power in the region to be in the same place at the same time. "What happens at the summit?" Lena said. Petra swallowed. Her eyes moved to Marin, standing 6 feet back, and Lena shook her head slightly. "Marin stays." "There's a petition being assembled," Petra said, "signed by 6 pack lords. It challenges Darius's right to hold the Alpha King position on grounds of succession instability." She paused. "The air Selene is carrying isn't Darius's." The cold air moved between them. "Voss arranged that," Lena said. Not a question. "Voss arranged everything. Selene Cross is Voss's cousin's daughter. She's been positioned for this for 3 years. The child she carries belongs to a man who is already dead. A wolf with no pack ties, no claim, no one to complicate the story. When the paternity question surfaces at the summit, it invalidates the succession argument Darius has been using to consolidate support. The 6 pack lords pull their backing, and in the power vacuum, Voss steps in as regent," Lena said. The shape of it was so clean she felt something almost like reluctant admiration for the architecture of it, immediately replaced by the cold recognition of how completely she had been used as a piece in it. "Or the person Voss is fronting for steps in." Petra nodded. "Who is he fronting for?" Lena said. Petra told her. The name was one Lena knew. A name from the southern territories, from the old families that had existed before the current kingdom structure, that had never reconciled themselves to what the Thorn Line represented. A name that had resources, patience, and a generational grudge. She stood against the outer wall of Black Hollow in the dark and felt the full scale of it come down around her. Not panic, something colder and more deliberate. The feeling of a person who has just seen the real size of the board they are playing on and understands that what they thought was the game was only the opening move. They had used her departure from Thornhold to destabilize the kingdom. They had let her run north, let her start building something in Black Hollow, because it didn't matter. Because in 3 months, at the summit, it all burned down regardless. Darius would fall, the kingdom would fracture, and in the chaos that followed, someone else would be positioned to collect the pieces. "How do you know this?" Lena asked. Petra looked at her. There was something in her face that was not quite guilt and was not quite apology, but sat in the territory between them. "Because I was part of it," Petra said. "Until 4 months ago, I was part of it. They recruited me 2 years ago through the Coastal Pack. I was supposed to monitor your correspondence, report anything that suggested you were getting close to understanding what Voss was doing." She held Lena's gaze through it. "That took something. You never wrote anything dangerous. You were too careful. But I was in it long enough to know the full plan." The silence between them had a physical weight. "Why are you here?" Lena said. Her voice came out flat. Not angry. Worse than angry. The tone of a person conducting a brutal assessment of information value. "Because when they told me the next stage involved making sure you couldn't interfere with the summit, not just locating you, but ensuring you couldn't interfere," Petra stopped. Her jaw tightened. "I'm here because you are the only person I have ever known who actually deserved what they were given, and I am not going to let them burn you down as a loose end." Lena looked at her for a long time. The grinding thing in her chest was not forgiveness. It was not trust. It was the acknowledgement that a person who has already been used once could choose, in the space of a single decision, to stop being used. And that choice cost something, and Petra had paid it by riding 6 days straight to a place she couldn't enter through the front gate. "Loose end," Lena said. "What exactly does that mean?" "There's a team," Petra said quietly. 3 of them. They left Thornhold 2 days after the scout. They're not coming to observe." The cold moved through Lena's chest like a hand. She turned and looked at Marin, who had been standing very still and very quiet, and who was now looking back at her with wide eyes, and the particular set of the jaw that meant the girl was already past fear and into the place where fear became something useful. "Wake Aldrich," Lena said. Marin went. Lena turned back to Petra. She looked at the woman who had been her closest friend and who had spent 2 years passing information to the people who had dismantled her life, and she said the only thing there was to say. "Everything you know, all of it, right now," Petra told her. It took 40 minutes. By the end of it, the cold had moved all the way through Lena and out the other side, and she had passed into a different temperature entirely. Not warmth, but the particular clarity that came when everything soft had been burned away, and what remained was only what could not be burned. Aldrich arrived halfway through with 4 of his senior fighters and stood at the edge of it, listening without interrupting, which she had come to understand was his highest functioning mode. When Petra finished, the knight held all of them for a moment. Then Aldrich said, "The 3 coming. Timeline." 2 days behind me," Petra said. "Maybe 3, if the ridge road slowed them." "It snowed on the ridge 2 days ago," Calla said from the doorway, where she had appeared soundlessly in the way she had of materializing wherever significant things were occurring. "Slowed everything moving north by a full day at least." 3 days then," Aldrich said. He looked at Lena. "We can handle 3. "You can handle 3, she said. "I need to think about the summit." "The summit is in 3 months. 3 months is not enough time if I'm starting from nothing," she said. "I'm not starting from nothing, but I need to know what I actually have." She looked at him directly. "I need to know if Black Hollow will stand behind me, not as an observer, not as a conditional advisor. If I bring a counter-petition to the Grand Moon Summit, if I walk into that hall and I challenge what Voss has built, I need to know who is standing at my back." Aldrich held her gaze. The fire in the wall torch nearest to them guttered in a wind that had found its way through the gap somewhere above the main gate. The cold pushed in. Everyone in the yard stood in the quality of the moment, which was the quality of a decision that could not be undone. "That's not a question I can answer in a yard at 3 in the morning," Aldrich said. "I know," she said. "I'm not asking for the answer now. I'm asking if the question is worth putting to your council." A pause. "The question is worth putting," he said. It was not a yes, but it was the door to a yes, and Lena Vale had spent enough of her life working with less. She looked at Petra, still standing against the cold stone of the wall with the exhaustion of 6 days and a turned conscience on her face. "You're sleeping inside tonight," Lena told her. "Tomorrow you give everything you know to someone who can write faster than I can. Then we decide what to do with you." Petra nodded. She looked, for just a second, like the person Lena had known before all of this. The girl who had grown up in the same territory and known the same cold winters and believed the same things about what loyalty was worth. That person was gone. They were both different now. The question was whether different was the same as finished. Lena walked back into the building. Her reflection caught in the dark glass of the main hall window as she passed. The riding jacket, the scar along her jaw, the face that had absorbed 5 years of a palace and was now absorbing something larger. She looked at herself for one unguarded second. She had come to Black Hollow to survive. She was going to have to do considerably more than that. The summit was in 3 months. Voss had 6 pack lords. She had the files in her head, a territory that was beginning to trust her, a woman who had just chosen a side at personal cost, and a man who had said the question was worth putting. And she had the name Petra had given her, the name behind Voss, the name of the person who had spent years building the trap that had swallowed Thornhold, who had used Lena as a demolition tool and expected her to stay demolished. That person did not yet know what they had actually built. They had taken a woman who knew how to hold a kingdom together, and they had set her loose with nothing to lose. There was a version of Lena Vale who might have gone to the summit to restore what had been taken from her. Who might have stood up to reclaim the Luna position, to take back the throne beside Darius, to put the palace back the way it had been. That version had died somewhere between the courtyard with the pale gray mare and a cold yard in the north at 3 in the morning. What was walking toward the Grand Moon summit was something that had never existed before, and it was not going there to restore anything. The 3 days passed like a held breath. Aldrich's fighters took the team Voss had sent on the second morning in the tree line half a mile east of the outer wall before they had gotten close enough to do anything but confirm that Black Hollow knew they were coming. There was no ceremony about it. 3 men with instructions that went beyond observation, met by 6 of Aldrich's best in terrain they knew, and the others didn't. It was over before the frost had burned off the grass. Aldrich told Lena about it at breakfast, the same way he told her most things. Directly, without theater, with the assumption that she could handle the information and would want it complete. She had come to depend on that quality in him more than she had expected to. In the palace, information had always arrived pre-shaped, trimmed of anything that might complicate the official read. Aldrich gave her things raw and trusted her to do the work. She did the work. The 3 months before the Grand Moon Summit became the most concentrated period of her adult life. She slept in 4-hour windows and worked the rest. Petra's information was the foundation. Names, dates, the structure of Voss's network laid out in the shorthand she had been using for years, and Lena built on it methodically, reaching out through Black Hollow's existing contacts to the pack lords who had stayed uncommitted, the ones who had been watching the Thornhold situation with the careful neutrality of people who had not yet decided which way the current was running. She did not ask for support. She offered information. She gave pack lords the thing they were actually hungry for, which was clarity about what was actually happening in the kingdom they were all embedded in, and she gave it without asking for anything in return except the willingness to listen. Most of them listened. Aldrich watched her work and said very little. Occasionally he would appear in the doorway of the council room where she had essentially taken up residence and lean against the frame with his arms crossed and observe for a few minutes, and she would feel the weight of his attention without looking up from whatever she was writing, and then he would leave. She was not sure what he was watching for. She suspected he was watching to see whether she was doing what he thought she was doing, or whether the version of Lena Vale he had been calculating with would eventually reveal itself to be smaller than he had measured. She did not intend to be smaller than he had measured. The council voted on the 4th week. Formal Black Hollow backing for her presence at the Grand Moon Summit, not as a petitioner or a witness, but as a faction representative with territorial standing. Aldrich read the motion into the record in the same flat, unhurried tone he used for everything, and when it passed 7-1, Calla being the holdout, not because she opposed Lena, but because she opposed any action that increased Black Hollow's exposure before the territorial water rights question was fully resolved. He looked across the table at Lena and said nothing. She said nothing back. The look was enough. On the night before they rode for the summit, she stood on the wall walk above the main gate and looked north at the territory she had spent 3 months learning, the settlement lights below, the tree line beyond the outer wall, dark and absolute, the sky above it vast and cold and packed with the kind of stars you only saw this far from anything that burned enough to compete with them. She was not the same person who had ridden out of Thornhold in the dark with 3 trunks and a jacket that was 4 years old. She knew that. The person she had been in the palace, skilled, indispensable, quietly bleeding, had been dismantled by everything that followed, and what had grown back in the space was harder and less apologetic and had a clarity of purpose she had never felt in 5 years of standing beside someone else's throne. She did not know yet if that person was better. She knew she was more dangerous. Aldrich came to stand beside her on the wall walk. They stood in silence for a while. It was a comfortable silence, the kind that had developed over 3 months of working in close proximity. The specific ease of 2 people who had learned to read each other without requiring constant translation. Voss will have someone watching the approaches, he said finally. I know. He'll know we're coming before we arrive. Good, she said. I want him to know. He looked at her sideways. The moment Voss thinks he needs to react to me, she said, he's already behind. He built a plan around a woman who would run and stay run. Everything he has is arranged around that assumption. The second I show up at that summit with a territory at my back and documentation that unmakes everything he's spent 2 years building, he's improvising. And Voss is not good at improvising. He's good at long games. Short games are a different animal. Aldrich was quiet for a moment. You've been thinking about him for 3 months. I've been thinking about the board for 3 months, she said. He's a piece on it, an important piece. But he's not the whole game. She felt him shift slightly beside her, the change in the quality of his presence, the same subtle adjustment she had noticed before, the rare moments when the compression of him eased by a fraction. She had learned not to comment on it when it happened. It was not for comment. After the summit, he said, What do you want? The question was larger than it sounded. She knew that. She had known for a while that there was a secondary conversation running beneath every practical exchange they had, a negotiation neither of them was conducting out loud because both of them were people who understood the cost of saying things before the time was right. To finish what I started here, she said, Black Hollow doesn't need a Luna. It needs a partner who knows how to hold a kingdom together without being held herself. She looked north at the dark tree line. That's what I want to build. Whether the summit goes perfectly or whether everything burns down, that's what I'm building. Silence. All right, Aldrich said. She looked at him. All right, he said again, like the word was a decision rather than an acknowledgement, and looked back at the stars. They rode for the summit in the morning. The Grand Moon Summit was held at the Plateau of Arden, a natural amphitheater of flat gray stone surrounded by the highland ridges where 3 territories met, chosen for precisely that reason. It belonged to no single pack, and therefore to all of them. They had been holding summits there for longer than anyone's recorded history stretched. Lena arrived on the 3rd day of the 5-day gathering, timing it deliberately. Not the first day, when positions were still being established and people were still watching to see what everyone else was doing. Not the last day, when decisions had already calcified. The middle, when tension was highest and uncertainty was most operative. She came in from the northern approach with Aldrich's riders flanking her and Marin at her left, and Petra 2 positions back, her presence a statement in itself. She rode Sable, who was rested and glossy and moved with the authority of a horse who had crossed hard country and come through better for it. She felt the summit before she reached it. The way sound carried differently when hundreds of people were assembled in one place, the low continuous hum of it on the cold air, the smell of smoke from the cook fires, the particular sharpened quality of the atmosphere when a great deal of barely managed political tension was occupying a confined geographic space. The outer perimeter guards checked them through. 3 of them, wearing the summit's neutral colors, and the one who came to her moved with the careful neutrality of a man who had been briefed on every significant arrival and was working very hard to display no reaction to any of them. She saw the flicker when he registered her face. the recalibration. He cleared them through without speaking. The main pavilion of the plateau was a wide, covered structure of heavy pole timbers and oiled canvas that had been assembled and disassembled at every summit for decades. The wood worn smooth with use, the smell of it a particular combination of old timber and cold stone, and the accumulated presence of 100 years of high-stakes negotiation. Around it, the delegations had established their camps in the organized clusters of a political gathering, the large territories with their flags and formal pavilions, the smaller packs with their practical tents, all of it arranged with the specificity of people who knew exactly where they stood relative to everyone else. She found the arrangement of Thornhold's delegation and read it in 3 seconds. Larger than 5 years ago. More formal, the kind of display that said someone had made decisions about projecting stability while feeling anything but stable. The colors were right, and the scale was wrong. And there, outside the main pavilion entrance, standing with 2 council advisors in the deliberate posture of a man waiting for something he had been waiting for and was not yet certain he would get, Darius. He saw her at the same moment she saw him. She had prepared for this. She had spent 3 months preparing for many things, and this among them, had worked through every version of the first moment they would be in the same space after the ash of his letter had risen into the cold black hollow air. She had thought she was ready. She was almost ready. He looked like he hadn't slept consistently in 3 months. The particular quality of his face under stress, the jaw tighter than it naturally sat, the eyes with that compressed brightness of a man running on adrenaline and will. And she recognized it from the difficult years of the border disputes and felt, despite everything, the involuntary recognition of 5 years of proximity. The body remembered what the mind had organized itself around dismissing. She let herself feel it and did not let it reach her face. She did not change her pace. She rode straight through the delegation's pathway toward the northern end of the plateau where Aldrich's standard was going up, and when her route took her within 40 yards of Thornhold's position, she did not look at him again. She felt him watching her all the way across the plateau. Voss she did not see that day. He was there. She confirmed it through 2 separate sources by mid-afternoon, a thin senior council member who had never managed to make himself less recognizable than he thought he was, but he did not appear where she was. She understood why. He was recalibrating. Petra had been right about the courier, and the courier's failure to report back had already told Voss that something was off. Her arrival at the summit with a full Black Hollow delegation told him the something was significantly off. Good. Let him recalibrate. Recalibration took time, and time was what she needed. The first formal session of the summit's middle day began at mid-morning in the main pavilion. All significant delegations assembled, the summit's presiding elder, an ancient wolf from the neutral Arden territory named Wex, who had been presiding at summits for 30 years, and who carried authority through sheer accumulated credibility, managing the proceedings from the raised stone at the pavilion's center. Lena sat with the Black Hollow delegation, Aldrich beside her. She watched the room, every face she had read in reports over 5 years, now present and reading her back with varying degrees of concealment. The first session was territorial boundary reaffirmations, the procedural work that summits began with. She sat through it and watched Voss in her peripheral vision, 3 sections across the pavilion, and watched the quality of his attention. The way a man paid attention when he was both observing the official proceedings and running a separate calculation simultaneously. He was good at it. The surface gave almost nothing. Almost. There was a moment, in the second hour, when she caught him looking at Petra. Just a fraction of a second, gone immediately. But the look had a specific quality to it, not surprise because Voss was too controlled for visible surprise. The compression of a man recalculating risk. He knew. She had expected he would know by now. She had built her strategy around the assumption that he would know and that knowing would push him toward acceleration rather than retreat, because men like Voss did not retreat when cornered. They moved the timeline forward. They used the assets they still had. She was watching for the move when Darius made his. He stood during the open petition period that followed the morning session. He was within his rights. Any delegation head could stand. He addressed the presiding elder with the formal language of official summit petition, and what he said was this, that in light of ongoing succession concerns at Thornhold and the disruption to the Luna position, he was petitioning the summit to formally recognize Celine Cross as the Luna designate, her status to be confirmed by the assembled pack lords. The room received it with the held breath quality of a gathering that had been waiting for exactly this and was now watching to see who would move first. Voss, from his position across the pavilion, said nothing. He did not need to say anything. He had the six-pack lords arrayed behind him and the petition documents already prepared, she had no doubt, and all he needed was for Darius to walk this particular floor a little further. Lena stood. The room reoriented. She felt it. The physical shift of several hundred people turning their attention simultaneously, the weight of it, the way it pressed on the skin. The summit recognizes, Wex began. Lena Vale, she said clearly, representing Black Hollow territory and the Northern Alliance. The Northern Alliance. She heard the murmur that ran through the pavilion at those two words. She had not announced the alliance publicly before this moment. She had spent 3 months building it quietly. 4 smaller pack territories north of Thornhold's Range who had been waiting for a reason to formalize their relationship with Black Hollow, and who had found, in the documentation she carried in her head and had laid out for them across a series of hard winter meetings, sufficient reason to act. Wex looked at her. The old man had seen everything. His face showed professional attention. You have a petition, he said. I have evidence, she said, which is different. She walked to the center of the pavilion. Her boots on the stone were the only sound for 3 seconds. She did not look at Darius, who was still standing. She did not look at Voss. She looked at Wex and at the assembled pack lords, and she said what she had come to say. She laid it out. Not as argument, as record. The financial documents reconstructed from her 5 years of administrative work, the debt arrangements, and the border agreements that demonstrated Voss's network of influence. The timeline of Celine Cross's positioning, corroborated by Petra's testimony and cross-referenced with the meeting records Aldrich's people had documented from Voss's Eastern contact 8 months ago. The paternity question, which she did not address through accusation, but through the documentation of Celine Cross's movements in the year prior to the announced pregnancy, movements that placed her at specific locations on specific dates that were not consistent with the timeline Darius had been given. She spoke for 11 minutes. She had practiced it down to the sentence. Every word earned its place. When she finished, the pavilion was absolutely still. Wex said, These are serious claims. They're documented claims, she said. The difference matters. Across the pavilion, she felt rather than saw Voss make his decision. The moment a man who has been outplayed in one direction decides to move in another. She had been waiting for it, and she felt it the way you felt a change in wind direction. Not the wind itself, but the air pressure shifting before it arrived. He stood. The Northern Alliance's documentation, Voss said, his voice carrying the careful control of a man who had spent decades performing composure, is the self-interested fabrication of a woman who was removed from the Luna position for conduct unbecoming and who has spent 3 months in a rival territory building a false case against the crown. The room moved again, louder this time. Removed, Lena said. Her voice was flat. Not removed. I walked out. There is a difference, and the difference is in the record. The record as you claim it, Voss said. The record as I built it, she said, for 5 years, while you were building something else. Darius, still standing, was looking at her with an expression she could not immediately read. Not the one she had expected, not anger or defensiveness, but something rawer and less controlled. The look of a man watching a conversation revealed to him the shape of something he had believed was different. Darius, she said, and the use of his name rather than his title landed in the room like a stone. Ask him about the courier, the one who came through the Black Hollow drainage culvert 3 weeks after your letter found its ash. Silence. Darius looked at Voss. The quality of that look, the slow turn of a powerful man re-examining something he had been certain of, was the first crack in the structure Voss had spent 2 years building. Lena watched it happen and felt the cold precision of the moment, the way a lock finally gives when you have found the exact right tension. Heron, Darius said. Just the name. Just that. Voss said, The courier was a routine. I didn't tell you about the courier, Darius said. Quiet. Dangerous. The pavilion held the moment. Voss's composure did something then that she had not been certain she would ever see. It shifted. Not collapsed, he was too experienced for collapse. But the surface moved, the mask readjusted a fraction in the wrong direction, and the room saw it. Pack lords who had been watching neutrally moved. Not physically, But she felt the reorientation of attention, the recalibration of 6 men who had been prepared to sign a petition that was now looking considerably less solid than it had 3 minutes ago. Voss looked at her across the pavilion. For the first time, he looked at her the way one player looked at another when they understood the board had been turned. "You have nothing that will stand formal challenge," he said. "Documentation from memory, testimony from a defector, an alliance with a pack lord who has avoided royal summons for 3 years. He let it sit. "It's theater." "It's a start," she said. "And you know what starts do." She reached into the document case she had carried from Black Hollow and withdrew the sealed packet she had not shown yet, the one Aldrich had told her about on the second day of her arrival, which he had been holding for 4 years, waiting for the moment it had the right context to be useful. The original record of Voss's Eastern meeting, not Aldrich's observation notes. The actual record, in Voss's handwriting, a set of instructions he had sent via a courier who had made the mistake of passing through Black Hollow territory and whose bag had been searched per standard border security protocol, and whose contents had been copied before the bag was returned, and the courier released none the wiser. She held it up. She did not need to explain what it was. The way Voss went still, the specific, complete stillness of a man who has just identified the thing that ends him, explained it for her. "Summit Witness Protocol," she said to Wex. "I'm entering this into the formal record." The old man looked at it, looked at Voss, looked at the room. "Accepted," he said, and the pavilion erupted. Not in her favor, not against her. In the raw, unmanaged noise of 400 wolves whose political reality had just shifted under them simultaneously, the sound of a structure cracking, of alliances that had been held by the expectation of a particular outcome suddenly freed from that expectation and therefore floating, temporary, up for renegotiation. Voss moved. Not toward her, toward the pavilion's side exit, the one that his position in the room had kept him near, and she saw the 2 men who had been seated behind him rise simultaneously in the coordinated way that meant they had been holding a contingency for exactly this moment. Aldrich was already moving. He crossed the pavilion floor with the focused, unhurried pace of a man who had seen violence coming before it arrived and had adjusted his position accordingly. And when Voss's 2 men moved to intercept the space between Voss and the exit, Aldrich's fighters came in from the flanking positions they had taken when they entered, and what should have been an exit became something else. Voss stopped. He stood in the middle of the pavilion with his exit closed and his documentation in evidence and 6 pack lords visibly reconsidering their positions. And he looked at Lena across the space between them with the specific expression of a man who had planned for many contingencies and had not, until this moment, planned for her. "It's over," she said. His jaw moved. The composure had come back, or the best remaining version of it, the hard shell of a man who would not give the satisfaction of visible collapse, even at the end of 15 years of work. "Not yet," he said. And then everything happened at once. One of his men, not the 2 that Aldrich had pinned, a third she had not identified, seated in the Thornhold delegation section where he had no business being, stood and reached inside his coat, and the object he brought out was small and dark, and the specific shape that changed the nature of every calculation in the room. Not a blade. Something worse. The pavilion's noise died so completely and so fast that she could hear the wind against the canvas above them. The man had the object aimed. Not at her. At Darius, who was still standing where he had been standing for the last 3 minutes, exposed in the center of the Thornhold section with no one close enough to matter. Lena moved before she had consciously decided to move. Across the pavilion floor, the distance was wrong for what she was doing. The angles were wrong. And she knew as she moved that she might be too late, and she moved anyway because there was nothing else to do, and she was done letting things happen to people in rooms while she stood still and absorbed them. Aldrich was faster. He came from the side she hadn't seen because she had been focused forward, and he hit the man low and hard, and the object discharged into the stone ceiling rather than into Darius Thorne's chest, and the sound of it in the enclosed pavilion was enormous, the crack of it bouncing off the stone and the timber and every body in the space flinching simultaneously with the instinct of living things. Lena stopped. She was 6 feet from Darius. He was looking at her, not at Aldrich, not at the man being restrained on the pavilion floor, not at Voss, who was being held now by 4 summit guards who had moved the moment the object appeared. He was looking at her with the face of a man who had just watched a woman he had publicly humiliated and dismissed run across a room toward him. "You," he started. "Don't," she said. Her voice came out uneven for the first time that day. The shake in it, not fear, but the aftermath of adrenaline, the body catching up to what the mind had done without consulting it. "Do not thank me right now. I did not do that for you." He closed his mouth. She turned to where Aldrich was getting up from the pavilion floor, the man subdued beneath him, Aldrich's jaw set and a cut along his cheekbone from the stone where his head had clipped the floor in the takedown, blood running in a thin line that he ignored entirely. She crossed to him. She put her hand on his arm, and he looked at her, and she looked back, and the thing between them in that look was not the thing you put into words in a room full of 400 wolves, but it was real, and it was solid, and she had built it the same way she built everything, from nothing, in hard country, over time. "Are you hurt?" she said. "I'm fine," he said, with the specific brevity of a man for whom that was simply true. She believed him. She turned back to the room. Voss was in Summit custody. His man was pinned. The six-pack lords were on their feet, and none of them were moving toward Voss. Celine Cross was not in the pavilion. She had never been summoned to the formal session, which was something Lena intended to address before the day was out. Darius was standing in the center of his delegation with the expression of a man who had walked into a building he thought he knew the layout of and discovered it was entirely different inside. Weck said, from the raised stone where he had not moved throughout any of it, in the voice of a man who had been presiding at summits for 30 years and had decided that his authority over these proceedings was not negotiable regardless of what fell from the ceiling. "The summit will recess for 1 hour. When we return, we will hear full testimony." The gavel came down, and Lena Vale stood in the middle of the Grand Moon Summit's pavilion, breathing, alive, with everything she had built for 3 months laid out in evidence, and the entire future of the kingdom balanced on the next hour's proceedings. She had 1 hour. She turned to Aldrich. "Find Celine Cross," she said, "before someone else does." He was already moving. Aldrich found Celine Cross in the Eastern Supply Tent. She was not hiding. That was the first thing Lena registered when he brought her to the small council space they had claimed at the back of the Northern Delegation's pavilion. The woman was not hiding, was not the collapsed or cornered figure that Lena had half expected after everything that had been said in the main hall. She was sitting straight in the chair they had put her in, hands folded in her lap, her face carrying the specific careful composure of a woman who had been performing composure for so long that the performance and the person had become difficult to separate. She looked younger than she had on the night in the Thornhold courtyard, or maybe what she looked was tired, the particular exhaustion of someone who had been holding a shape they were not built to hold for longer than they could sustain it. Lena sat across from her. Aldrich stood at the tent's entrance with his arms crossed, the cut on his cheekbone dried now to a dark line. He had refused anything for it. Lena had stopped offering. Celine looked at her, not with hostility, with the careful assessment of a woman taking the measure of the person across from her and finding the situation different than she had been told it would be. "You're not what I expected," Celine said. "No one ever is," Lena said. "Tell me what you want." The directness landed. Celine's hands shifted slightly in her lap. "I want out," Celine said. "I have wanted out since the 4th month. I want to go somewhere that Voss cannot reach, and I want the child to have a name that isn't a weapon." Lena held the woman's gaze. There were things she could have said. She had carried enough anger about this specific person, the pale gray mare and the hand on the abdomen and the east wing, to fill the tent several times over. She had organized that anger carefully over 3 months, had used the sharpest edges of it to work when she was tired, had let it burn the soft parts of her hesitation away when she needed to be harder than she naturally was. She was not angry right now. She was looking at a woman who had been recruited at 23 by her older cousin into something too large and too cold for the person she actually was, and who had been trying to find the door out of it ever since. "The child's paternity will come out in testimony," Lena said. "I can't protect you from that." "I'm not asking you to protect me from the truth," Celine said. Her voice was steady. "I'm asking you to protect me from what Voss does when the truth is out, and he has nothing left to lose." Lena looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "Where do you want to go?" Something in Celine's face shifted. The composure cracked just slightly, just at the edges, the way ice cracked when the temperature underneath it had changed, not breaking, but showing the seam. "There's a coastal settlement in the southern range," Celine said. My mother's people. They're not pack, not political. They fish, and they're left alone. She paused. I know what I was used for. I know what I cost you. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking for a road. Lena stood. She walked to the tent entrance and stood beside Aldrich for a moment, looking out at the plateau of Arden where the recess hour was burning through its last minutes and people were beginning to move back toward the main pavilion. The political landscape of the next 2 hours was as mapped as she could make it. The evidence was in formal record. Voss was in custody. 4 of the 6 pack lords had already sent quiet emissaries to the Black Hollow delegation in the last 40 minutes, which was the kind of rapid recalibration that happened when people who had committed to a position saw the position collapse and needed to establish that they had always been persuadable. She thought about roads, about the specific nature of a choice that cost you something and gave you nothing back except the ability to look at yourself with a steady eye. I'll send 2 of Aldrich's riders with you, she said. After the testimony. You speak truthfully in that hall, and I give you the road south. Behind her, she heard Celine exhale. Just that. Thank you, Celine said. Don't thank me, Lena said quietly. Raise the child to know that people are not tools. That's enough. She walked back out into the cold Arden air. The testimony session lasted 4 hours. Celine spoke first. She spoke clearly and without embellishment. The voice of a woman who had decided that the only thing she had left to spend was the truth and intended to spend it completely. The paternity question was addressed, the timeline of her recruitment, the nature of her arrangement with Voss. She named names, she provided dates. She did not cry and she did not perform contrition. She simply told what had happened as it had happened, and the pavilion absorbed it in the particular silence of a gathering that is listening to something it cannot unhear. Then Petra spoke. Then Aldrich, for the record, presenting the 4-year-old documentation from Voss's courier. Then Lena. She had spoken once already, but this was different. Not presentation, testimony. Wex asked her questions in the careful, methodical way of a man who understood that how a record was built determined how it held. She answered each one completely. She spoke about 5 years at Thornhold, about the administrative records, about what she had seen and managed and understood. She spoke about the night of the courtyard and the East Wing announcement, and she did not dress it up or make it a wound to display. She stated what had happened as historical fact, which was its own kind of ferocity. At one point she felt Darius's gaze from across the pavilion with the physical weight of prolonged, focused attention. She did not look at him. Not avoidance. She had looked at him directly when she needed to, when the testimony required it. But the private version of looking at him, the 5 years version, was not for public record. That she kept. Voss did not speak in his own defense. He sat in the summit custody position with the locked stillness of a man who had calculated that anything he said would be used and had decided the only play was silence. She respected the calculation while understanding it was already too late for it to matter. He had been outmaneuvered at the level of documented evidence, and silence could not unmake a document. When the testimony concluded and Wex called for the pack lord's deliberation, Lena walked out of the pavilion and stood in the cold Arden air and breathed. Marin came to stand beside her. The girl said nothing for a while, which was growth. 6 months ago, Marin's response to Lena's silences had been to talk into them. How do you feel? Marin asked finally. Lena thought about it. It was a genuine question and deserved a genuine answer. Like something is finishing, she said. And I don't know yet what that means for what comes after. Marin nodded slowly. Calla says the Pack Lords are already talking about a formal recognition of the Northern Alliance. Calla would know. She also says Aldrich has not stopped watching the door you went out of since you left. Lena was quiet for a moment. Calla should manage her own affairs, she said, without heat. Marin made a sound that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one and said nothing further, which was the other part of her growth. The deliberation took 2 hours. When the Pack Lords returned, the result was not a surprise, but the formal weight of it still had a gravity that the anticipated version didn't. Voss and the 3 named co-conspirators were stripped of council standing and remanded to territorial custody pending a full royal inquiry. The 6 Pack Lords who had signed the original petition issued a formal withdrawal and a statement of support for the summit's investigation process, which was the political language of people covering their exit. Celine Cross was formally released from any Luna designation claim, her testimony accepted as cooperative, her request for southern settlement passage noted in the official record. And the Northern Alliance, Black Hollow, and the 4 territories Lena had spent 3 months building, was formally recognized as a sovereign political bloc within the kingdom's territorial structure, withstanding at future summits equal to any pack of equivalent size. Wex read it all into the record in his flat, authoritative voice, and when he was done, he looked across the pavilion directly at Lena with the expression of a man who had seen a great deal across 30 years of summits and was making a specific notation. She held his gaze and nodded once. He nodded back. Darius found her at the edge of the plateau as the afternoon was going long and cold, the light dropping behind the western ridgeline and the shadows of the highland stone stretching across the flat gray rock. He came alone, which she noted, no advisors, no guards at useful distance. Either trust or theater, and she had learned to tell them apart in him. It was trust. She gave him that. He stopped 6 feet from her. He looked like the weight of the day had settled on him physically, the way sustained stress settled, in the shoulders, in the jaw, in the eyes that had the wrung-out quality of a man who had been stripping away comfortable assumptions all afternoon and was now standing in what remained. "I owe you more than I can say," he started. "You don't owe me anything," she said. "What happened today happened because it needed to happen for the kingdom, not for you, not for me." He was quiet for a moment. "That's not what I mean." "I know what you mean." She looked at him directly. "Darius, I spent 5 years loving you. I spent 3 months past that understanding what it cost me. I'm not going to stand here and tell you it was nothing, because it wasn't nothing, but I'm also not going to carry it anymore." She breathed through a beat. "You mistook the thing that held your kingdom together for something you owned. That's the truth of it. No villain required. Just a man who never learned the difference between loyalty and property." His jaw moved. The specific movement she had seen 1,000 times when he was holding something back that he did not know how to say. "I know," he said. Just that. And the 2 words had a weight to them that all his formal court language never had, the stripped-down quality of a man saying the truest available thing. She looked at him for a long moment. There was grief in it. She did not pretend there wasn't. 5 years of a life did not become nothing because the ending was necessary, and grief was not the same as regret. She had learned that distinction in a cold room at Black Hollow in the small hours of many mornings. "Run the kingdom," she said. "Run it properly this time. The eastern settlements need the road funding I kept arguing for. The border tax schedule needs a competent administrator, which means you need to find one rather than assuming the work is doing itself. The water rights dispute in the Northern Range will come back to you formally within the year, and you should be prepared for it." She paused. "You know how to lead in the open. You never learned how to govern in the quiet. Learn it." He looked at her with the expression of a man receiving something he did not deserve and knew it. "Is there anything," he said carefully, "that would make you—" "No," she said, gentle, absolute. "There isn't." He held the word, held it the way a person held the final confirmation of something they had been hoping might not be final. Then he straightened, and the Alpha King came back into his posture, not as performance, but as the man picking up what was his and accepting the shape of what wasn't. "The Northern Alliance will have full trade access as far as I can make it stick," he said. "I know you'll make it stick," she said. "That part you're good at." Something moved in his face. Not quite a smile. Not nothing either. He turned and walked back toward the Thornhold Pavilion. She watched him go for a moment and then turned back to the ridgeline and the dying light and the long shadow of the highlands on the plateau of Arden. The grief sat in her chest with a clean weight. Not a wound, more like the specific ache of carrying something a long distance and finally setting it down. The sensation of the absence of the burden, which was its own kind of heaviness until the muscles remembered what it felt like to be without it. She had loved him. That had been real. What she understood now, standing on cold stone in the last of the afternoon light, was that loving a person and belonging to them were not the same thing, and she had spent 5 years confusing the one for the other. Survival had required her to learn the difference. Most things of value she had learned in the last 6 months had come through exactly that mechanism, the specific education of being stripped down to what was actually true. She did not regret the 5 years. She regretted that they had cost her the time it took to learn what she now knew. That was the only thing. And even that, she was finding, was becoming less a wound and more a simple fact. Things cost what they cost. The accounting was what it was. Aldrich came to stand beside her. He had cleaned the cut on his cheekbone finally. The line of it was visible in the fading light, thin and dark. He stood close enough that she could feel the warmth of him against the cold air, and said nothing in the way he had of offering presence without requiring it to be anything. "It's done," she said. "Most of it," he said. "The inquiry will run for months." "I know. But the thing that needed to break in that pavilion today, that's done." He was quiet for a moment. The wind moved across the plateau. Below them, the summit settlement was alive with the specific quality of a large gathering at the end of a significant day. The noise of people processing, the cook fires going, the hum of hundreds of simultaneous conversations all working through the same new reality. "You know what I noticed?" Aldrich said. "In the pavilion, when that man stood up." She waited. "You moved before you had a plan," he said. "You just moved." "That was stupid," she said. "That was real," he said. She looked at him. He was looking at the ridgeline, the clean profile of him in the last light, and she understood that he was saying something he did not know how to say directly, and was saying it sideways instead because he was, under the efficiency and the compression, a person who found the truest things difficult to put straight. She understood that completely. She was the same. "Aldrich," she said. He looked at her. "I'm not going back to any palace," she said. "I'm not going back to being anyone's Luna. I'm not going back to standing beside something rather than standing as something. Whatever this is," she gestured, a small motion that encompassed the two of them and the space between them and everything that had been built in 3 months of hard country and hard work. "It has to be between equals, or it can't be anything." He held her gaze, the dark eyes that she had spent 3 months learning to read, that gave things away only when he chose to give them, gave something now. "I have never in my life," he said, "wanted anything other than an equal." The wind moved. She turned back to the ridgeline, and after a moment he turned back also, and they stood together in the last of the cold Arden light, not touching, not needing to, with the particular quality of two people who have come to understand each other in a place without theater, and who find that understanding sufficient. The summit fires below were coming up bright against the early dark. 3 months later, Black Hollow was not the place she had ridden into on a frostbitten morning with 3 trunks and a 4-year-old jacket. What it had become was harder to describe in simple terms, because the change was not in the buildings or the walls, but in the quality of the thing the buildings and walls contained. 4 territories formally allied, with shared trade agreements, a unified approach to border security, and a council structure that distributed decision-making rather than concentrating it. A water rights resolution that had been negotiated without threats and had held through the first hard winter because the terms had been made by people who understood what the water was actually worth and had not been performing strength for an audience. A justice protocol that the smaller pacts in the region had begun citing in their own internal disputes because it was, by common assessment, the most functional framework anyone had seen come out of the Northern Territories in a generation. Lena had built most of it, not alone. Aldrich's instincts and his people's loyalty and Calla's blunt institutional knowledge had been as much a part of the structure as anything she brought. But the architecture was hers in the way that certain things were yours, not because you held them, but because they had grown from the particular shape of how you thought. Petra was still there. That had been a harder calculation. The specific question of what you did with a person who had been against you and then chosen not to be, there was no clean answer to it. Trust was not the word for what existed between them now. It was something more provisional and more honest, the working relationship of two people who understood each other's capacity for both loyalty and failure because they had seen both in action. It was enough. It was more than enough some days. Maren had stopped watching the door. The inquiry into Voss's network ran through the winter as Aldrich had predicted. She gave testimony twice more, submitted documentation, answered questions from the formal investigative council with the same methodical precision she had used in the pavilion. Voss himself never spoke publicly, not once through the entire process. The silence of a man who had decided that history would be written regardless, and he would not dignify it with participation. She did not know what to make of that choice. She had spent some time trying and had eventually put it down. Understanding the particular shape of his refusal was not worth the cost of carrying it. Darius sent a formal trade agreement in the 2nd month. The terms were fair. She reviewed them herself, made 2 amendments, returned them with a note that was professionally cordial and nothing else. The agreement was signed within the week. The eastern settlements got their road funding. She knew because she had asked Marin to monitor the royal expenditure announcements, and Marin had brought her the record with the particular expression of someone delivering news they had not been certain would come. She sat with that information for a while. It was not satisfaction exactly. It was the quiet acknowledgement that sometimes the right thing happened because you had made it expensive for the wrong thing to continue, and that this was how most real change worked. Not through transformation of character, but through the rearrangement of costs and consequences until the correct behavior became the path of least resistance. She had spent 5 years believing in a more idealistic mechanism. She still believed in it. She simply no longer believed it was the only one. On the night that the last of the formal alliance documentation was signed, all 4 territories, their marks on the record, Aldrich's at the top, hers beside it, she walked out to the wall walk above the main gate, the way she had on the night before the summit, and looked at the territory below. The settlement lights were bright in the early spring dark. The snow had come off the ridgeline in the last week, the first real evidence that the season was turning, and the air had that particular quality of cold that was beginning to remember warmth, the undercurrent of something coming through the ground that had been locked down for months. She thought about who she had been on the night she rode out of Thornhold, the woman with the 3 trunks and the flat grief and the body that had gone somewhere ahead of the mind. That woman had been capable, skilled, had known how to hold a kingdom together, and had done it for 5 years without adequate recognition and without asking for recognition because she had believed, at some level she had not examined closely, that doing the work was its own sufficient justification. That belief was not wrong, but it had been incomplete. What she understood now, standing above a territory that had chosen her and that she had chosen back, not because she was useful to it and not because she needed it to survive, but because she had built something real here, and it was hers in the way that only freely made things ever were, was that sufficiency was not the standard, that doing the necessary work without asking for recognition was a virtue up to the point where it became a habit of making yourself invisible, and past that point it was a slow erasure. She had stopped erasing herself somewhere between a cold creek crossing in the Highland Range and a pavilion at the plateau of Arden. She could not point to the exact moment. She suspected it had not been a moment, but an accumulation. The days of work, the council meetings, the hard conversations with pack lords who needed to be shown rather than told, the specific education of building something in a place that did not owe you anything and finding that the thing grew anyway. The real strength, she had learned, was not in holding on. It was not in position or title or the formal weight of standing beside the right person in the right hall. It was in the willingness to walk into the version of yourself that the catastrophe had forced open and to find that what was inside it was not less than what had been burned away, but something different, harder in some places, more willing to bend in others, and fundamentally more honest about what it wanted and what it would not accept. That was the thing she had not known how to name when she was at Thornhold. The palace had given her everything except permission to know what she actually wanted. She had been so well trained to be indispensable that she had forgotten to ask whether she was happy, whether the life she was holding together was one she would have chosen with open eyes. The answer, at the honest bottom of it, was no. Not because of Darius, not only because of him, but because she had been living inside someone else's framework for so long that she had stopped being able to see the outline of her own. Losing it had felt like the end. It had been the beginning. Aldrich came up the wall walk steps. She heard his boots on the stone and did not turn immediately. He came to stand beside her, close, his shoulder an inch from hers. They had moved through something in the months since the summit. Not dramatically. Nothing between them had ever been dramatic, which was one of the things she valued most about it. It had been an accumulation of chosen proximity, of small, specific trusts built and tested and rebuilt. Of 2 people who were both constitutionally inclined toward self-sufficiency, finding, with some surprise, that being alongside someone was not the same as being diminished by them. She had not been certain, for a while, that she was capable of that distinction anymore. She was glad to be wrong. "Last signature," he said. "Last one," she agreed. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You know the Western settlements are going to bring a new water complaint in the spring session. I know. I've been looking at the creek diversion maps. There's a workable solution. It just requires 2 of them to cede a half-mile of informal grazing claim, and neither of them wants to go first. So we make going first worth something." Trade concession on the southern pass toll, she said. Whichever territory yields the grazing claim first gets the rate reduction for 1 season. Enough to make it the smart move rather than the lose